where you get into trouble is where you don't address issues at the partnership, and then the business starts to suffer because the partners can't get along and they can't find a shared vision. And then as the business starts to decline, then you start running out of options. So one of my favorite quotes from Charlie Munger is, "Show me the incentives and I will show you the outcomes." And no place are the incentives more important than the way that you set up your partnerships when you are doing business. And a lot of people hear horror stories about what happens when you are in business with someone else. And they kind of make this blanket decision, which I don't think is the right one, but it's like, I'm just going to do business by myself because the hassles of what happens and all of the horror stories that happens when you have partners that you bring to the table, just the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And there are a couple things that you can do that I'm going to talk about today with some stories. And this kind of came up because I had a buddy that messaged me that's been running a business with a family member for a couple years. And the business is doing well. It's starting to take off. And the family member that he's been in business with has kind of felt pulled to something else. And you could tell that, like, the expectations that both of them have are getting wider and wider in terms of what the brother who wants to leave is looking for and what my friend who is staying and running the business is looking for and what he thinks the business can afford. And so he called me asking what the options look like in order for him to come to an amicable resolution in the business while keeping the relationship with his family member. And I've been through this a fair amount in all of the businesses that I've run. And I'm still of the mind that a great partner that you can do business with, where the incentives are aligned and everyone is incentivized to make the business grow, someone who has skin in the game, meaning they've bought in and they can experience the upside in the business as well as the downside in the business. If the business loses money, they lose money. And if the business makes money, they make money. When you have that type of relationship with someone and you can get on the same page in terms of what the vision looks like, that's the alchemy where you really get spectacular outcomes in business. And it's worth going through the process to find that and to experience it. And there are a couple things that you can do that can protect you from the downside risk of everybody gets into the business and they all think it's going to go great, and either it doesn't go great or it takes longer than expected, or a partner has something that happens in their family that was unexpected, or sickness, illness, moving, relocation, change in priorities for whatever reason, a kid gets sick. All those things change the expectations of the people that are in business together. And so then the question becomes whether the business is going poorly or whether the business is going great. Typically, the setup is there is one person who is running the stuff and kind of making everything go, and everyone else, or some combination of everyone else, is kind of more on the peripheral, cheerleading, but not really running the stuff, not very heavily involved operationally. And that may have been the expectation when the business partnership got set up. Typically there are passive investors that are just there providing capital, and then operators that are getting sweat equity. Whatever the setup is, I'm going to break down a couple things that I told him that to think about in terms of the situation was he's an active operating partner running the thing and has given up opportunities to do other things that he's not pursuing because he's running this business. And he has a family member that is not doing that, that is doing his own thing and has an expectation. And it's just getting to the point more and more that as the business continues to grow, the relationship will continue to fracture. And so you kind of have a spectrum of the way that you can deal with this, from very amicably, very kindly, very reasonably, and then very militantly, very aggressively. And so on the aggressive side, one of the first documents that you sign when you get into business with each other is you all kind of sit around a table and you go over a formation document, depending on what the entity is, whether it's a operating agreement or bylaws in a company, whatever. It's basically, here's the way that we're going to manage this relationship as we continue to go forward. and here's the money that people are going to put up. Here are the expectations. Typically, people want more equity because they think if the business is going to do well, that they will be able to capture more of that upside. That and they're, the whole idea is we're only doing this because we think this is a money making venture. And so if this thing makes money, then we want to be aligned and work on this thing together. And so equity tends to be this thing that everyone wants to fight for. And equity tends to be the thing that when you're disagreeing as partners, you want to figure out a way to get the person out. And so one of the ways to do that on the most aggressive side, and this is what I told my buddy, is basically create capital calls. And a capital call is when you go to the equity holders and say, hey, the business has a shortfall. And that shortfall is going to require $10,000 total. And based on however our equity is split up, if I own 50% of that, then I owe 5 grand. You own 50%, then you owe 5 grand. So we each got to come up with $5,000 in order to keep this business running. And as you start creating capital calls for the equity partners, the ones that are on the sidelines that aren't doing as much, those people tend to try to find a way to head towards the exits. And as you capital call them, they just find a way to kind of like get out and they want to get out. So capital calls are one way to kind of depress the value of the company. So that way you can get to a real conversation on how to move forward. Second thing that you can do when you're forming those original agreements with each other, the operating agreement typically, is you usually do something called a buy sell provision. And what a buy sell provision is it says if we ever get to the point where we don't want to do business together or we can't do business together, a partner is getting divorced and the divorce court says that they need to value the equity and get a buyout, whatever. A buy sell provision is the provision that gets used in order for the partners to come to the conclusion of what the business is worth. And so you can use a buy sell provision with something that's called a Mexican shootout. That's not the legal term, but that's the basically how it's used in common day parlance. And so what a Mexican shootout is, it is where one partner says, I think this business is worth $1 million. I own 50% of it. You own 50% of it. So I set the value, whatever I think the value is, and you decide whether you want to buy me out or I buy you out. So I say it's worth $1 million. You say, great, I think it's worth $1,002. So at $1 million, I'm the buyer. I'm going to buy you out of the business and I'm going to continue to run this thing by myself. And that's one way to get partners out that need to be out while also keeping the people in that can run it. And one of the benefits of a Mexican shootout with a buy sell provision is typically the partners that are on the sidelines that aren't doing as much or don't know what's going on, they will find a way to get out of the business because they know that if they're tasked with running the business, it's not something that they're going to be able to do. And so their willingness to pay a premium in order to have access to the entire business is usually much lower than who the active partner is. And so Mexican shootouts tend to favor the active partners because the active partners know what's going on. They know who the employees are. They are confident that they can continue to run the business without the other people in the business. It's not as aggressive as capital calls, and it's not as friendly as just seller financing, which is the most friendly. But it's one kind of middle ground option that you can do. And the third kind of most friendly option is you come up with a seller financing deal where you say, listen, this isn't working. Let me pay you 5 grand a month for the next 20 months in order to buy you out of this business. So that way you get cash flow. You make more than you're currently making as an owner of the business. But at the end of those cash flow payments, you will have nothing. And a lot of times on the seller financing side of it, you end up making a deal like I'll pay you this out, but on the off chance that I end up selling this business or I get a new round of financing, or if there's some massive benefit that happens in the business within the time period that we're talking about in terms of me buying you out, then I'll give you an additional benefit. I'll give you some percentage of that upside. So I actually sold my interest in one of my trampoline parks on a deal like this, where it was a cash payout that was a lower number than what I probably could have gotten on the open market, but I would have had to go through a full diligence period with a buyer of them trying to understand what the business is, do all this stuff. And so I sold to a partner. And the deal was if in the next 24 months, even though I was selling at kind of a depressed value relative to what the fair market would pay for it, if that new buyer, my old partner, finds a fair market buyer in the next 24 months, then he's gonna give me an adjustment, and I'm gonna get an additional cash payout. Because I was worried. I was gonna sell for pennies on the dollar, quarters on the dollar, and then he would flip around and go out into the fair market and just sell it for much more, and, that he was just gonna flip it on me, and so that provision we put in as a way to protect my fear that he would just flip it. So, it kinda just depends on how important it is for you to maintain a relationship with your partners as you just transition and shuffle the equity stack in terms of the best way to move forward running the business. In my experience, typically the people that you start the journey with aren't always the people that you end up with. I've had partners that were there at the very beginning, and they were there with me at the end, and we've started new things since then subsequent to that. But the common thread among all of those partnerships is that we've continued to make an effort to build a relationship outside of just running the business, that we weren't just business partners, that we became kind of friends that continue to do things, and we continue to do that even when business wasn't going as well as we wanted it to. The important thing is when you start on this journey with someone, trying to see them in as many aspects and in as many contexts as you possibly can as you're in the process of getting business. Are they trustworthy? Are they hardworking? Are they ethical? Or do they share traits that you can tolerate? And in all three of those categories, and you put provisions in place in the operating agreement that allow for an easy way for you to move on, and having those conversations of I always frame all partnership conversations on the premise of what's fair, what's reasonable. Here's how I see it from my point of view. Help me understand what your point of view is on this. Help me understand what you view as reasonable. And let's try to see where there's a middle ground here. Because where you get into trouble is where you don't address issues at the partnership. And then the business starts to suffer because the partners can't get along and they can't find a shared vision. And then as the business starts to decline, then you start running out of options. You can always figure out something when you have something that's making money and that's producing, and it becomes very difficult to do when you have partnership issues that are then leading to an asset that is declining in value over time. So, those are the three things that you can look for and do if you're running into partnership issues. And let me know if you enjoyed this format a little bit more of me just kind of riffing on a topic, on conversations that I have on a daily, weekly basis, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace.